Hello everybody, I'm Graham Roberts and I'm going to take you through the Dedicated Schools grant for 2022-23 and also have a look at the other grants that we pay to local authorities and schools. That will be based on the grants that we've paid this year in 21-22. I can't say anything about grants for next year because they will be subject to the spending review later in the autumn. I'm listed here some of the grants that we currently pay, includes the Dedicated Schools grant. These are the ring-fence grants that we pay out on a formula basis to local authorities. I've also put the links in there so you can read up on those in more detail, and we'll make those available also after the session. The school improvement grant at the bottom there used to be an unring-fenced grant, but it's become a ring-fenced grant recently to help with the recovery from the pandemic. We have grants also that support local authority expenditure that are not ring-fenced. I've listed those there. The top two are paid by the ESFA. The bottom two are paid for by the DFE, so you may see a bit of difference on your remittance advice to those. The financial transparency grant is a new grant this year to help with the new financial transparency arrangements placed on maintained schools from this year. And we've also had a lot more grants this year as a result of the pandemic, additional grants that have gone out to schools and to local authorities. And thank you very much for helping with those. It's been, in some cases, a very quick turnaround. And so your help in doing that has been much appreciated. The three grants there at the bottom, the recovery premium, the allocations for that were announced on Wednesday, and for school-led tuition, we will announce those shortly. And summer schools, we're still processing the applications, but more details should come out shortly again later in the autumn. I'll move on to the Dedicated Schools grant. So this is for 22-23, and there will already have been information published in terms of the national funding formulas back in July, and I'll be referring to those as we go. So the Dedicated Schools grant paid to local authorities can only be spent on the school's budget as defined in the school and early years finance regulations. They're updated every year. The school budget is a bit of a misnomer because of course it does cover early years and central budgets as well. For financial year 22-23, we'll continue to base the funding on the four funding blocks that we've had for some time now: the schools block, the central services block, the high needs block, and the early years block. Those are not ring-fenced blocks as such. However, there are some rules around movements between the blocks, and those are chiefly on the schools block. So you can only transfer up to 0.5% of the schools block to another block, and that has to be with the approval of the schools forum, and schools, including academies, should be consulted about that amount. And you should also take into account recent increases in high needs funding when having those discussions, because much of the school block transfers that we've seen have been to the high needs block to help with pressures there. If you want to do something outside of those rules, then you need to submit a disapplication to the department by the 19th of November this year. That would be for movements out of the schools block that are more than 0.5%, or any movements at all out of the schools block that do not have your forum's approval, but you wish to proceed with them. If you have submitted a disapplication, you then have another window by which to adjust and amend that disapplication if there have been significant changes since the original submission. That can be if there's, for example, different demand for high needs provision, or your pupil numbers in October are significantly different from the expected numbers. When you do submit disapplication requests, then you should also provide detailed evidence as set out in the pro forma that's on gov.uk. Movement out of the other blocks is allowed in consultation with the schools forum, so there's less rules on those. For the early years block, that will be subject to the pass-through rate condition. That's where we set a percentage of the early years block that must be passed through to early years providers. Out of the schools block, you should consult the relevant representatives for that block, i.e. high needs providers, etc., or the subgroups on the schools forum, as they are the ones clearly most likely to be affected by the transfer. And movement out the school central block is allowed in consultation with the forum. If there are DSG balances at the end of the year, they can be carried forward. So underspends can be carried forward to the next financial year. However, that can only be spent again on the school's budget because they're still governed by DSG rules. And also the schools forum should be consulted about the use of any of those underspends, and also their consent will be required if any of that is going to be used for central budgets, i.e. it's not going to be part of the formula that's going to schools. For deficits, they can be carried forward to the next or following year, either in full or in part. And if you do set those deficits against a subsequent year, then you must plan to eliminate the part of the deficit you've passed through from DSG resources received during that financial year. If you want to use general funds, i.e. not DSG resources, to eliminate any part of a deficit or add general funds to your school's budget, then you must apply to the Secretary of State for permission. That was a new rule introduced for 21 and 22, and that will carry on in 22-23. I'll move on to the allocations process. So we normally issue allocations for the DSG in the December prior to the relevant financial year. So for 2022-23, that's December 2021. The schools blocks allocated using the units of funding that we published in July, multiplied by the October 2021 school census numbers. And similarly, the allocations of the high needs block will be based on the NFF and the basic entitlement announced in July, updated for the October 2021 school census data. The CSSB, again, allocated on the units of funding published in July, and then using the same pupil numbers from October 2021 that we use for the schools block. There'll also be additional allocation for the historic commitments funding, with some protection in place there because there's a reduction of 20% in the historic commitments. There is protection allowed if you find yourself in the position of you think you need protection. You can apply for that on that email address. If you already have put evidence in about that last year, we will again look at that for you for this year. For the early years block, we will issue a provisional allocation in December based on the early years national funding formula, which will be published later in the autumn. So we haven't published the details yet of the early years funding for 22-23, but we'll do so prior to December and then issue a provisional allocation. We'll also confirm in December the charges that we're making for the national copyright licenses. That's where we have negotiated with the 10 copyright license agencies a total amount for all schools in England, so that schools and local authorities don't have to make individual contracting arrangements with those agencies. So that effectively means that schools have a copyright license for the 10th thing covered by those 10 agencies. And we'll also issue a VAT invoice during the financial year to allow you to claim back the VAT on those charges. We also update the DSG during the year, so the December announcement of the allocations is the start rather than the end of the process, and the main updates there are for schools that have become academies since we made the announcement in December, so that you're getting the right amount and we're getting the right amount back to pay on to academies. We'll also make an update in spring 2022 to reflect the new data for the import-export adjustment. This is where we're making sure that where a pupil is lives in one authority but is educated in another, that the funding is going to the right local authority that is picking up the bill. We'll also update the early years block during the year for the latest census data, and the earliest we can do that is July 2022. So we then carry on through the year with academy conversions, so that by the end of the financial year, your final allocation should reflect the number of maintained schools that you've actually had to fund during the year, whether that's in full or in part. We then have another final adjustment in July 2023 to take account of the fact that we want to make sure that the early years block is as closely funded to the termly funding that you actually put out to providers. So to do that, we want to be able to use the January 2023 data to cover the September to March period. But because of how long it takes to sort out the January census, we wouldn't be able to do that till July 2023. That's again not a new process. We've been doing that for some time. Although this year, because of the pandemic, we've had to move that to November rather than July, so that the details for that will come out in due course. Payment and assurance. So the DSG is paid in 25 instalments across the financial year. It's a financial year grant, not an academic year grant. We pay 3 instalments in April and 2 per month from May to March. That is to reflect the profile that we had when this money was in the local government finance system, and when the money was moved across as DSG, we didn't want to have a significant impact on local authority cash flow, so it's still 25 instalments. And for 2022-23, we will set that out in the conditions of grant. At the end of the year, the local authority's chief finance officer is required to submit a statement confirming that the DSG has been used in line with the grant conditions. For 2021, that's going to be due to be submitted in early November 2021. So for 22-23, going forward a fair bit, that would actually be November 2023. And then I've also set out here some of the grant timetable for the other grants that we've got. There's a variety of profiles depending on the nature of the grant, because some of these are allocated on an academic year basis rather than a financial year basis. So they start, they're either split between April and October, or they won't start until September. And I've set some of those out there. And as I say, the recovery premium, school-led tuition, the recovery has already been announced, and the school-led tuition will be announced shortly. There will also be an assurance statement for these grants. What we normally do is in April, we will send out one single assurance statement. We'll list all these grants. This is separate from DSG, so it doesn't cover DSG. It will list all these grants for assurance. And usually that goes out in April for return in mid-May. Again, this year it went out a bit later and was returned in July because of the pandemic, and also because of the large number of grants that we had. Thank you to everybody for returning those during the summer. That's been very helpful, and appreciate, it was quite short notice in terms of quite a significant number of grants that were on that assurance statement, so that has been appreciated. So I'll stop there. That's a quick run through. Thank you for your time, and if you do have any other questions, then let us know and we'll try to get back to you on them as soon as possible. Thank you very much.